Greetings and welcome to today's hour-long painting lesson. I'd like to begin by simply thanking you for joining me here today. I hope you have a lot of fun, and as per usual, if you have any questions at all, let me know. All of the tools will be linked in the description, and as per usual, we are beginning this lesson here today with a large, damp, square-headed brush. So I actually began this painting by dipping my brush in some water, getting a little bit on there, wiping off the excess, grabbing some titanium white from my palette, and applying that to the sky here. Now I'm applying the titanium white to the entirety of the sky as it's really going to thicken all of the colors that I put on top of it, and it's going to desaturate them just a little bit, which is actually a good thing because in the background of our paintings we generally want everything to be more desaturated. We want to save those saturated tones for the foreground where we can see much more of the innate coloring of things. The background colors have much more reflected light around them, all of the colors kind of blend and it dilutes everything just a little bit. So if you want to create a lot of depth in your painting, start off by creating a background that is a bit more desaturated than you want your foreground. So with that said, here I'm taking a little bit of my primary yellow and I'm applying it to the top of my sky and blending downwards. Now, as you can see, the primary yellow is much more desaturated and light than what it is on my palette. And that's because, again, there's just so much titanium white on the canvas already. From there, I'm going to mix up an orange. This is a mixture of our primary red and our primary yellow. I'm applying it to the base of the horizon and then I'm blending upwards. However, I'm using the smaller, sharper edge of the brush this time and moving back and forth with horizontal strokes to kind of create the impression of hazy clouds in the background. Now, from there, I'm going to switch over to an older square-headed brush. This is one where the bristles kind of leaf off in varying directions, so when you make a tapping motion with it, you render just a litany of implications on the canvas. So it can save a lot of time, and it also creates a lot of diverse, very small implications that you wouldn't have been able to make otherwise with a traditional brush. So I'm using this here, and I mixed up a bit of a green. This is a mixture of primary yellow, primary blue, Mars black, and titanium white. Now the Mars black and the titanium white were used to A, thicken the pigment, but B, also desaturate the pigment. Again, we are working in the background, and I don't want anything too stark because I'm saving those natural colors for the foreground. Now this pigment here, it is a green. It's a bit more of an olive green than a very fresh green, and that's because when you mix a good amount of primary yellow with Mars black, you get more of a warm, heavy green as opposed to a cool, fresh green, which you can get with a primary yellow and a primary blue. So from there, I'm also going to grab a bit of a darker mixture, apply that to the base of my tree line, and then blend upwards. Now I'm going to go back and grab the older square-headed brush. Here you can see just how kind of broken down the bristles are. You can make one of these very simply by just peeling back the bristles of any square-headed brush, kind of pushing it up against the table. You really can't get this wrong. All you need to do is ensure that your brush looks a little bit disheveled and like it's been through a lot. So that's essentially what I'm grabbing here, and now I'm recreating the base to my trees, and I'm going to start blending it downwards this time in that tapping motion. That way we also have the reflection of the foliage. Now here I'm grabbing my medium-sized square-headed brush. I'm grabbing some burnt umber, a little bit of primary red, a good amount of our primary yellow, almost double primary yellow to primary red. Primary red is a much stronger pigment. Primary yellow is easily overtaken, so we're using a lot more of that. We're throwing this all together in a mixture, and I'm just trying to apply what I think might be a good highlight to the edges of these rocks here. Now these are going to kind of connect our foliage on top of our land masses down into the water, and I'm just kind of testing colors right now. I'm thinking, okay, if the sky and the reflected light is all very yellow, it's very orange, what are these rocks going to look like? They're probably not just going to be a gray, they're probably not just going to be a brown, they'll probably have a lot of that highlighted color in it. If you kind of get a little bit of a grain, a little bit of a canvas tooth showing through your rocks, it'll actually look quite nice, as it'll look like little rough protruding areas as well. So we can be much more rough with the application. Now here I'm grabbing the older square-headed brush yet again. I'm creating another green, so I have a good amount of primary yellow, I have some primary blue, some Mars black, and here I'm grabbing a lot more of that primary yellow yet again. And now I'm going to go in with a tapping motion, as you can see here, for the foreground. For the foliage, it's going to be a lot of bush work instead of grasses, and I'm doing this so that I keep the application consistent with that of the background, but I also don't want a lot of linear strokes in the grass area, because I'm going to do these very linear strokes and applications in the weeping willow tree. If the tree had more of this tapping effect instead, then I might do more of a linear grass. But I'm essentially just trying to ensure that the painting is well balanced and it doesn't have too much of one thing or the other. Then I'm going to go back to my palette, I'm going to grab some additional Mars black, and then I'm going to start throwing that into the areas that I think are going to be receiving less light. So the areas that are much closer to us, as we kind of dip down on these hills, and the tops of them are getting much more light, and then as we get back farther, we get more shadows from the trees, but we're also farther away from the light. So I'm starting close to us and I'm working that way. Again, we're creating a gradient from dark to a mid-tone, but we're not doing so with a conventional blend or stroke. We're doing so with a myriad of tapping motions. So we're creating a lot of interesting texture, and we're ensuring that the pace is kind of always evolving. So here I'm creating a bit of a highlight, and now I'm tapping that on where the light is really going to be hitting the foliage, the bushes here, all of the little draping pieces as well. So I'm making these tapping motions. I'm occasionally rotating my brush in the air to create something that's a little bit different from the last application. I'm also trying to leave a lot of little openings and different clusters as well, because different pieces of foliage, different bushes are going to be protruding more, catching more light. Others are going to be darker as more shadow is cast upon them, and it's important that we try to keep all of these little intricacies in the back of our heads, as they'll make for much more interesting subjects throughout this process. But here I'm going back down into my rocks. I'm using my smaller square-headed brush. I started with the darker base layer, then here I'm adding in a bit of a mid-tone. The mid-tone has a lot of gold on it, and that's because of the reflected light from the water as well as the reflected light from the sun, though I think I'm going to go back in and interject a little bit more color just to diversify it and ensure that the gold from the rock doesn't blend too much in with the gold of the water. We are now jumping into the top of the painting, and I'm doing so with a tapping effect with the medium-sized square-headed brush. I'm using here a mixture of our Mars black, of a little bit of titanium white, of a good amount of primary yellow, and we're getting a really nice rich olive color with this. Again, if you want a heavy olive green, then use a Mars black and a primary yellow. If you want more of a fresh cool green, use a primary blue and the yellow. Here I want it to look like the light is passing through all of this hanging, dangling foliage, and so I want it to be much warmer. I want it to be a much more heavy, rich, goldy yellow. Now here, as you can see, we have a bit of a darker mixture of a green, and I'm working that in from the top for the most part, and I'm blending it down through this series of tapping motions, as you can see. I'm doing this to create a bit of a depth. We essentially started with the highlighted color. Now I'm going back in and I'm adding a mid-tone. I'm allowing it to blend, but I'm, for the most part, allowing the pieces that are really drooping down to be much brighter, as those areas of foliage are going to be much more thin. So much more light can pass through them and illuminate them. Now, if you look up top there, I began working on the darker foliage. This is the foliage that is closer to us, and it's darker because there's so much foliage in the way that the light isn't passing through it at that point. But before we do that, I want to work on my actual trees first, on the limbs, the branches, all of that, because we're going to be layering the new foliage on top of it. So I'm essentially beginning here with the smaller square-headed brush. I'm using a bit of a Mars black, I'm using a bit of a burnt umber, and I'm filling in the smaller branches. I'm also using a bit more of a watered down mixture for this as well, because it's going to help me create something that's much more sharp. When your brush is fully dry and you try to make a stroke, you'll probably get something that's a little bit more chalky. You get something with the tooth of the canvas showing through much more so. But when you have water on it, the pigment, it'll be much more transparent, but you're going to get something much more sharp. So when you're working on the very fine branches that lead up to the top, the ones that are much smaller, you want to apply a lot less pressure so that the bristles don't expand, but you also want to ensure that your brush is fairly damp so that you can create those nice sharp edges on either side of each branch. I'm creating the darker foliage now that's going to be layered on top of our initial layer of foliage and on top of our trees. And I'm doing this in the same way that I did the initial application. It's done through a tapping motion, holding the brush in a vertical orientation. I'm doing it with a much darker green this time, and that's because, again, the light isn't going to get to this foliage in the same way that it did to the front line of it. There are going to be much more shadows here, and it's going to be a little bit thicker as well, so less penetrating light can get to it. Now here I'm going back in and I'm adding that reflection that we actually talked about at the start of this lesson. Now I can apply these hundreds of little horizontal strokes that get larger and larger as we move away from the sun. And the goal here is to ensure that the initial middle application of the pigment is nice and thick. It is paint on paint. You are not dragging the brush on the canvas. Then as you get towards the edges, you drag the brush on the canvas a little bit so it gets a little bit more transparent, and then you lift your brush slowly so you relieve pressure and you get that transparent edge. So you get a very thick middle to each stroke, and then as it veers to the right and to the left, it begins to dissipate and dissipate until you get something that's transparent and you get this very natural look of light shimmering across the water. It's a great, easy way to create the reflection of light, and I'm also trying to be fairly playful with it. I'm ensuring that different areas pop more than others. I'm leaving little openings in different areas as well. Hey there, it's Ryan O'Rourke. I truly hope you enjoyed today's little extra video. It was essentially a cut-up version of one of the many hour-long lessons which we offer over on patreon.com. Over there you'll also find digital sketches of the 10-minute painting lessons, digital sketches of these hour-long painting lessons, and a bunch of reference photos as well. So if any of that interests you, or if you just want to support the channel, go over there and check it out. It is a pleasure to make these long form videos, and I love to share them with all of you. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next Saturday with a new video, and above all, as always, stay creative.